My goal in these lectures is to use the insights, take the insights from the ancient Greeks, and to explain them in a way that we can use them to create an international civilization in the era of globalization. So I did have 3 lectures about Aristotle's ethics and politics, and they were complicated. I talked quite a bit, for example, about decisions and all the parts of decisions. And when we look at Hesiod, Homer, tragedy, and Plato, we will see people making decisions. But this lecture is going to be sort of the Reader's Digest condensed version of ethics and politics as a lead in to Aristotle's view of tragedy and the arts. And then, before we go into some specific literature. So the main point is that these are universal patterns and principles. They're kinds of activities of soul, energia, like seeing is an activity of soul, but it originates in the sensible world. Thinking is that next step, it's beyond anything connected. It's when we start reflecting and recognizing, and that's an activity of soul, which is unique to human beings. When we start to seek patterns and we start to pursue the good life, not mere survival, and not so. So this is what I'm going to do: talk about ethics and politics in the next hour or less, and then go on to Aristotle's view of human production and specifically artistic production. Aristotle's ethics can best be understood as a biologist's discussion of the natural well-being or perfect condition of the species Homo sapien. For Aristotle, to be virtuous is simply to perform the natural purpose or final cause of human life. A virtuous person is one whose soul is completely developed. Quote, if we take the proper function of man to be a certain kind of life, and if this kind of life is an activity, energia, of the soul, and consists in actions performed in conjunction with the rational element, and if a person of high standards is he who performs these actions well and properly, and if a function is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the excellence appropriate to it, we reach the conclusion that the good of human beings is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and most complete. Unquote. From the De Anima, we learn that sensation, perception, and imagination trigger appetite, desire, and action directed toward the apparent good. A person who fails to act well, whose reason is clouded over by emotion, is a person in whom pleasure and pain are corrupted. Quote, for the sensation of pleasure belongs to the soul, and each person derives pleasure from what he is said to love. In most people, pleasant acts conflict with one another because they're not pleasant by nature. But people who love what is noble derive pleasure from what is naturally pleasant, and as a result, such actions are not only pleasant for those who love the noble, but they're also pleasant in themselves. The life of such people has no further need of pleasure as an added attraction, but it contains pleasure within itself. We may even go so far as to state that the person who does not enjoy performing noble actions is not a good person at all. Nobody would call a person just who does not enjoy acting justly. Unquote. Aristotle's ethics follows the same underlying principles which were in the De Anima. There is a hierarchy of activities of soul. The healthy soul is one that develops the most complex activities, and human beings must develop from less rational to more rational. The Nicomachean Ethics explains how children must be raised so that their natural appetites, the desire they have in common with other animals, can be ordered in ways which will enable the mature adult to make the transition from being motivated by sensation and unexamined opinions and desires to being motivated by reason. Children are born with the potential to become virtuous, to act on the basis of reason, but they start out life being motivated by pleasure and pain, sensation, perception, and imagination. Each virtue is developed through habituation. A child has consistently been required to act according to what reason requires, reason being determined by parents, teachers, and other adults. Quote, "The virtues are implanted in us neither by nature nor contrary to nature. We are by nature equipped with the capacity to receive them, and habit brings this ability to completion and fulfillment. We become just by the practice of just actions, self-controlled by exercising self-control, and courageous by performing acts of courage." Unquote. Children have to be taught to take pleasure in virtue, because a truly virtuous action is chosen for its own sake by an adult with a firm character. Quote, "In the case of the virtues, an act is not performed justly or with self-control if the act itself is of a certain kind, but only if in addition the agent has certain characteristics as he performs it. First of all, he must know what he's doing. Secondly, he must choose to act the way he does, and he must choose it for its own sake. In the third place, the act must spring from a firm and unchangeable character." Unquote. The virtues are responses to fundamental human activities of the soul. Each virtue is a way of engaging in that activity which leads to the most excellent human life. For example, temperance is the virtue in relation to pleasure and pain. A temperate person eats the right thing for the right reason in the right way at the right time, and takes pleasure in acting that way. Same with drinking in the right way, and the same with sexual self-control. In summary, quote, all the pleasant things that contribute to the self-controlled person's health and well-being he desires moderately and in the way he should." Unquote. The extremes in relation to the virtues are excess and defect. In the case of temperance in relation to eating, the extremes are gluttony as the excess and anorexia, undereating, as the defective state. In the case of drinking, the excess is drunkenness and the defect abstinence. In the case of sex, the excess is promiscuity and the defect is abstinence. There are 5 different conditions of the soul in relation to each of the virtues. If a person desires what is right, knows what is right, and does it at the time, this is the full development of the power of soul in relation to that virtue which in turn is related to a particular natural desire. If a person knows what is right, does not want to do it, but does it anyway, the person is said to be morally strong in relation to that particular desire. If a person knows what is right, does not want to do it, and desire overpowers reason, or the apparent good overpowers the true good, a person is said to be weak-willed, morally weak. If a person does not even know what's right in relation to a specific desire, the person is said to be self-indulgent. Courage is the virtue in relation to situations involving fear. In such situations, a courageous person will choose to do the right thing for the right reason in the right way, etc. Quote, "The courageous person is dauntless as a human being. He will fear what is fearful. He will endure it in the right way and as reason directs, for the sake of acting nobly. That is the end of virtue." Unquote. Situations requiring courage include illness, dangerous situations, life-threatening situations, and situations of a soldier in battle. The morally strong person will not always want to act courageously, but will do so anyway. The morally weak person will not want to act courageously and will act on the basis of emotion rather than reason. The self-indulgent person will not even recognize the need to exercise courage in a given situation. The extremes are cowardice, when a person runs away from a situation that requires courage, and rashness, when a person seeks out dangerous situations for no reason or because they desire to take unnecessary risks. Because we are by nature social and political beings, meaning we need other people in order to develop naturally, every healthy human being should also have the virtue of generosity, which usually means giving away money. The person who gives the right amount of money for the right reason, in the right way, etc., is said to have the virtue of liberality. It's also possible to give too much or too little. If a person has a great deal of money and resources, the virtue is called magnificence. In situation where the rational response is anger, the person who's angry for the right reason in the right way at the right time is even-tempered. The extreme of excess is having a temper, and the extreme of defect is apathy. Throughout Aristotle's theory of the virtues, the discussion is about physical as well as mental health, because the two cannot be separated. A person who does not get angry enough, or gets too angry, not only is unpleasant to be around, but suffers physical ailments related to the incapacity to hit the mean between extremes. A sense of humor is one of the virtues, because it's one part of having a healthy attitude toward life. Someone without a sense of humor is boring, and someone with an irrational sense of humor is vulgar. High-mindedness is the mean between vanity and small-mindedness in relationship to honor and dishonor. Righteous indignation is the mean between envy and spite in how we react emotionally to the fortunes of our neighbors. Truthfulness is the virtue in relation to oneself. Those who have this virtue know what they know and don't know. They know their strengths and weaknesses. They know which virtues they have and which extremes are most likely to draw them away from the mean. Someone might be able to hit the mean in relation to eating, but tend to drink too much, for example, or someone might be very generous, but a coward in situations involving fear. Rational ambition is knowing exactly which talents you should develop and then moving forward in society and trying to place yourself in the get yourself in the place where you will be able to exercise your highest capacities to the highest level. And you can be overly ambitious and be over your head, or you can not be ambitious enough. There are 3 levels of social development: the cultivation of personal virtues, which focuses on the training of instincts; the cultivation of friendships, which focuses on creating a climate of trust and stability in a society; and the cultivation of justice, which enables citizens who don't know each other personally, but who are bound together under a common set of laws, to treat each other appropriately. Aristotle has a complex theory of friendships because he thinks the bonds of affection between people based on social interaction, not directly related to political association, are important for developing personal character and interpersonal trust between people who know each other. A good lawgiver is concerned with the level of friendship in a society because bonds of affection create concord or discord within a state, and people's love of and loyalty to their friends affects their love of and loyalty to the state. There are 3 kinds of friendships between equals, determined by what draws the friends together. Some friendships are based on usefulness. Since human beings have many different needs, they depend on each other to meet the more basic needs, and friendships develop from these dependencies. Other friendships are based on pleasure. Certainly pleasure and pain are motivating factors in human behavior. But when pleasure is the main motive for a certain relationship, this is the kind of friendship that results. But the highest human needs are all connected to the desire to know. The highest kinds of friendships have a foundation in some concept of goodness, in the exercise of some virtue, and the realization of the most complex and uniquely human activities of soul. These kinds of friends might be bound together by a common love of their country, which leads them into war and to exercise courage. They might be bound together by a common love of generosity and the giving of money to meet various social needs. They might be bound by a common intellectual pursuit, or they might be bound by a common love of justice, which motivates them to exercise authority in some capacity, or to make laws, or to create social institutions. Most of our human relationships, however, are based on inequality and require the exercise of authority. Parent-child, husband-wife, ruler-ruled, teacher-student, master-slave are all based on inequality. I should, instead of master-slave, you'd say employer-employee. And the affections of each person are different in relation to each other. Relationships between siblings are relations of equality, but are different than relations between equals who are not from the same family, or who don't know each other personally. Aristotle has a lengthy discussion of what people in relationships of equality and inequality owe each other. Without getting into specifics, the overall picture Aristotle gives of the human condition is that human beings are fundamentally and intricately interdependent. They rely on each other in numerous ways, which leads to a complex nexus of owing and being owed in return. Human beings don't like to admit how dependent they are, so they quarrel about who owes what to whom. These intricate interdependencies are one of the main underlying presuppositions in tragedy. Tragedies occur to some extent because we need each other and don't always meet the needs of those who depend on us or get our own needs met. This leads to many, many ways of going wrong, of making false judgments about good and evil, justice and injustice, virtue and vice. The most important factor in developing friendships of the highest order is to know oneself as a rational being and to love oneself as a rational being, meaning a being with mind or nous. The rational person will love to do what is noble and right, and hence will be better able to determine what is best in a given situation. The best people identify themselves with their minds, their nous, and make choices that enable them to exercise the virtues as much as possible in one lifetime. Quote, "The person whose standards are high judges correctly, and in each case what is truly good will appear to him to be so. Perhaps the chief distinction of a person of high moral standards is his ability to see the truth in each particular moral question, since he is, as it were, the standard and measure for such questions." Unquote. Although disagreements still arise, there will be far fewer quarrels and disagreements among those who are virtuous and rational than among those who are not. Once the personal virtues have been cultivated in the home, and friendships have begun to evolve beyond kinship relations, the next virtue to develop is justice. Justice is the desire for the common good, for the good of fellow citizens who do not know each other personally, but who are bound together by a set of laws and institutions. Quote, "Justice is a relation to our fellow person in that it does what is of advantage to others, either to a ruler or to a fellow member of society." Unquote. Quote, "Political justice means justice as between free and actually or proportionately equal people, living a common life for the purpose of satisfying their needs. Justice can only exist between those whose mutual relations are regulated by law." Unquote. There are 4 aspects to the virtue of justice. 5. The first is the mean in relation to the pleasure which comes from the desire for profit, for making money, and enjoying material prosperity. Justice in respect to this desire is the desire to take what one needs or deserves and not to want more than one's share. Quote, "To act unjustly, meaning to assign oneself too large a share of things generally good and too small a share of things generally evil. This is why we do not permit a person to rule, but the law, because a person rules in his own interest and becomes a tyrant. But the function of a ruler is to be the guardian of justice, and if of justice, then of equality." Unquote. The next disposition in relation to justice is the ability to make good laws. Good laws are those that promote a strong and stable middle class. The third one is the ability to make good judgments about how to distribute limited social goods. Such goods are not simply material ones, but goods such as education and social status. In respect to distribution, the starting assumption is that people are unequal in their needs for various social goods. Some people need more food because they're larger than others. Some need more education because they have a particular natural capacity for certain kinds of intellectual activities. The just person begins with the assumption of inequality and then makes a decision based on what is appropriate to give to each person so that everyone's needs are met as well as possible A just person makes good decisions in particular cases with respect to this issue. The fourth capacity is the ability to make good judgments in cases where someone is being harmed by another and needs to be recompensed. The wrong done must be rectified. In these cases, the people involved should all be treated as equals, and the decision made should be based on the wrong that was done, not on the particular individuals involved. Being rich or having status should not factor into the decision. The fifth capacity is the ability to make a good decision in a particular case. The laws are always general because they're written to apply to an entire class of individual cases. The just person can recognize which factors of a particular case would require the laws to be applied best in a particular way. Quote, "The equitable is a rectification of law where law falls short by reason of its universality. A man is equitable who chooses and performs acts of this sort, who is no stickler for justice in a bad sense, but is satisfied with less than his share, even though he has the law on his side." Unquote. For example, in a murder case, it's important to determine, in the context of a law court, in a murder case, it's important to determine whether the murderer acted from passion or from deliberation. If the murderer planned out the killing, this is a sign of a wicked character, of someone who does not believe killing others is wrong. This is self-indulgent. If the murderer acted in a moment of passion, this person is weak, has a weak character, is overcome by passion, but does not think it's right to kill people. This is less wicked and would lead to a less severe sentence. Clearly, to be a just person does not merely mean that a person obeys the laws of a given society. In some cases, if a society is unjust, someone might feel compelled to disobey the law. In general, however, it is best not to change the laws too much and to obey even imperfect laws, because most people's behavior is restrained by the force of law rather than by the power of reason. Once all of these personal, social, and political virtues have been developed and have become second nature, habits of action and thought, the culminating virtue in relation to human action is what Aristotle calls practical wisdom. This is the ability to see with one's mind the way that all the other virtues interrelate, and to be able to act according to the appropriate virtue at a given time, as well as the desire to choose to exercise as many virtues as possible whenever possible. Quote, "A truthful characteristic of acting rationally in matters good and bad for man." That just means you have a firm and unchanging character of doing what's best in the situation, which is the truth of the situation. You're literally incarnating the truth, because in practical affairs, the truth is the action. It's the human good in action. It's not some opinion about practical wisdom. It's what you actually do that determines if you're practically wise. It is proactive rather than reactive, meaning a person of practical wisdom creates opportunities to exercise virtue rather than just doing so when necessary. The person of practical wisdom acts from a conceptual mental image, not an image based on perception. Quote, "The principles or initiating motives are the ends at which our actions are aimed." This particular conceptual image uses the imagination. So that's why in literature you have these images of people doing things, because that's how the audiences learn how to live, is that they first they imitate, or they take in the image, and then they figure out the reason why one action and one justification for an action or one application of a principle is better than another. They watch the characters do the right thing or do the wrong thing, and then they can figure out in their own minds why that's the case, and that's how they become educated. A person with practical wisdom understands the natural principles of virtue, and hence can teach and make laws that promote human well-being. Further, since practical wisdom is concerned with actions, and actions take place in particular situations, the person of practical wisdom is also good at examining all possible actions in a given situation, and at choosing which alternative is best, and then acting on it. Quote, excellence in deliberation will be correctness in assessing what is conducive to the end, concerning which practical wisdom gives a true conviction. Unquote. Practical wisdom is a certain eye of the soul, a way of seeing with the mind. The person of practical wisdom is focused on a certain mark to aim at, what is best in the situation. There's some target on which a rational man keeps his eye as he bends and relaxes his efforts to attain it. And this goes on in the literature all the time. People are deliberating about what is the goal of human life in general, what's the goal of this particular situation that we're in, what are the alternatives, what is our goal, then what are our real options in this situation, what's attainable, which might be a long way from the goal, and which one of those attainable actions, the possible actions, is best, and why. Why is this particular choice going to aim at the human flourishing, the ultimate goal? Practical wisdom includes both intellect and emotion because it concerns making the right choices constantly. Quote, if the choice is to be good, both the principle must be true and the desire right, and that desire must pursue the same things as principle affirms. Now the cause of action, the efficient cause, is choice. And the cause of choice is desire and reasoning directed towards some end. So the cause of my action is not universal peace. I can't choose universal peace. What I can choose to do is either to fight or not to fight today in this war and this situation. So the cause is my choice I make among the possible options. And the cause of the choice is desire. I won't choose it unless I want it, and I want it because I've reasoned about it, I've thought about it, and I've decided it's the best choice. Hence, choice necessarily involves both intellect or thought and a certain disposition of character. Hence, choice may be called either thought related to desire or desire related to thought. As human beings, as an originator of action, is a union of desire and intellect. You always see that in the literature because they don't act without thought, but their characters affect what they desire, they affect what they think, and they affect what they choose. It affects what they think the options are, it affects what they think the best option is, it affects what they think the ultimate goal is, it affects what they think the proximate goal of a certain campaign or a certain decision is. People with practical wisdom also tend to be able to speak well about human actions. They have the characteristic of understanding, quote, the use of one's faculty of opinion in judging statements made by another person about matters which belong to the realm of practical wisdom, and in judging such statements rightly. And again, you have people in this literature are always talking about decisions that are being made, or somebody's character, somebody's reasons. So they really do express opinions about judgments made by another person or choices made by another person. Okay, persons of practical wisdom also tend to have what is called good sense, which Aristotle says the quality which makes us say of a person that he has the sense to forgive others. Sympathetic understanding is a correct, critical sense or judgment of what's fair, and a correct judgment is a true one. So, people with practical wisdom can forgive other people. That's having good sense. People with practical wisdom also have sympathetic understanding, which is they can they can talk about, they can make a judgment about what's fair in a certain situation, which is apart from whether there's any choice involved. They're just evaluating the situations around them. Quote, we attribute good sense, understanding, practical wisdom, and intelligence to the same person. They have mature intelligence or a mature mind. Practical wisdom is nous directed toward actions. Even though talking about human action is different from acting, quote, we ought to pay attention to the sayings and opinions, undemonstrated though they are, of wise and experienced older men, for experience has given such men an eye with which they can see correctly. And again, you see in tragedy older people giving advice. Sometimes it's good advice, sometimes it's not so good. And there are certain characteristics of older people. There are clearly the ones for whom life has increased their wisdom, and then there are those who become bitter about life or get corrupted by their experience and sort of give in to moral weaknesses. Clearly, Aristotle believes that his theory of the virtues applies to all human beings, apart from when or where they live. Societies can be evaluated as better or worse, according to whether the laws and habits of the people are closer or farther from the development of the virtues. For Aristotle, human culture, meaning educational institutions, legal systems, family groups, social institutions, economic institutions, etc., can all be evaluated according to whether they aim at developing the virtues, the ultimate flourishing of human nature, or have a corrupting influence on human appetites and desires. The principles of politics for Aristotle are the same as, or analogous to, the principles of psychology and ethics. First, order is prior to disorder, because the universal is prior to the particular. Individual human beings have natural drives and souls which develop in ways which allow for individual variation, but the most important activities of the soul and the most basic principles of ethics and politics are true for every member of the species. People can best be defined and understood as members of the species, and their psychological and moral development can be evaluated according to how closely it conforms to universal standards of human well-being. Second, there is a hierarchy of activities of soul and moral development. A baby is engaged in one set of activities and actions and develops over time. All psychological and moral development can be evaluated according to whether it is at a higher level of sophistication and flourishing or at a lower level. Third, the human species, like all other species, possesses a drive to achieve its ultimate flourishing. This is the full development of all activities of soul and the full development of good action. In the case of politics, the psychological activities and actions involved are an extension of ethics, or they emerge from ethical behavior. Ethics involves personal virtue and interpersonal virtue. Politics is human interaction based on the most complex and complete kind of human interaction, community between people bound together under a set of laws. Quote, while all partnerships aim at some good, the partnership that is the most supreme of all and includes all the others does so most of all and aims at the most supreme of all goods, and this is the partnership entitled the state, the political association. The city-state is the end of the other partnerships, and nature is an end, since that which each thing is when its growth is completed, we speak of as being the nature of each thing. The city-state is a natural growth. Man is by nature a political animal. Laszlo would say that just like life emerges from the non-living, and self-conscious reflection emerges from life, and then social, cultural systems start out at the simpler level and they gradually become more and more complex. Even though people come together for the sake of mere survival and for more security, these are not the final cause or the flourishing of political association. Quote, if people living near each other had no mutual dealings in anything except such things as exchange of commodities and military alliance, even this would not be a state. A state is not merely the sharing of a common locality for the purpose of preventing mutual injury and exchanging goods. These are necessary preconditions. But a state is a partnership of families and clans in living well, and its object is a full and independent life. So, we don't live just to survive, just to protect ourselves from outside enemies or from being more efficient at getting food, clothing, and shelter. We want intellectual engagement. We want culture. We want the arts. We want creativity. We want to desire to know. We enjoy things beyond mere necessity. Only human beings are by nature political animals because they have the ability to be motivated by thought rather than sensation. Quote, "For it is the special property of human beings, in distinction from the other animals, that he alone has perception of good and bad and right and wrong and the other moral qualities, and it is partnership in these things that makes a household and a city-state." Unquote. Further, human beings possess speech, the capacity to articulate what reason understands. Quote, "Man alone of the animals possesses speech. Speech is designed to indicate the advantageous and the harmful, and therefore also the right and the wrong." Unquote. The activities of ruling and being ruled are good. Quote, "Authority and subordination are conditions, not only inevitable but also expedient." Unquote. People need to be ruled either because they're young and not yet able to rule, or because they possess moral virtue by habit only and cannot develop full practical wisdom, or because they happen to be in a position where they must carry out the commands given by someone else. Quote, "All must partake of the moral virtues, but not in the same way, but in such measure as is proper to each in relation to his own function. The one is courage of command, the other is that of subordination, and the case is similar with the other virtues." Unquote. Just as people achieve higher or less high levels of moral development, so also different people have a right to exercise political authority based on their personal character and ability to exercise authority well. Quote, "The political fellowship must be deemed to exist for the sake of noble actions, not merely for living in common. Hence those who contribute most to such fellowship have a larger part in the state than those who are their equals or superiors in freedom and birth, but not their equals in civic virtue, or than those who surpass them in wealth, but are surpassed by them in virtue." Quote, unquote. In theory, the activity of being a good ruler and a good citizen should be both be aspects of being a good person. Quote, "Although the goodness of a ruler and that of a subject are different, the good citizen must have the knowledge and ability both to rule and be ruled, and the merit of the good citizen consists in having a knowledge of the government of free people on both sides, ruling and ruled, and therefore both these virtues are characteristic of a good person. It is not every citizen, but only the statesman, the person who controls or is competent to control, singly or with colleagues, the administration of the Commonwealth, who is essentially also a good person." Unquote. Even though some people possess complete practical wisdom, while most people do not, there's still a good reason to distribute political authority, or some degree of it, to everyone. Quote, "For it is possible that the many, though not individually good people, yet when they come together may be better, not individually but collectively, than those who are so. For where there are many, each individual, it may be argued, has some portion of virtue and wisdom." Unquote. The best constitutions, therefore, give some political authority to the masses, especially the right to vote for their rulers, but give others the right to exercise political rule. Quote, "Over what matters is the authority of the free person, the mass of the citizens, to extend, for it's not safe for them to participate in the highest office, but yet not to admit them and form them not to participate is an alarming situation. For when there are a number of persons without political honors and in poverty, the city is then bound to be full of enemies. It remains, therefore, for them to share the deliberative and judicial functions. For this reason, Solon and certain other lawgivers appointed the common citizens to the election of the magistrates and the function of calling them to audit, although they did not allow them to hold office singly. For all, when assembled together, have sufficient discernment, and by mingling with the better class are of benefit to the state. But separately the individual is immature in judgment. Unquote. So Solon set up trial by jury and also the assembly so that people would engage in deliberation about the common good, partly because in order to cultivate their souls, and partly because you get better judgments that way, because you're less likely to have emotion cloud judgment, because when it's everybody together, they can recognize when somebody else's emotions are clouding their judgment, and they can correct for each other's imbalances. Further, it's best for the laws to rule rather than individuals, because people are subject to passion. But the laws are too universal, and the application of the laws requires deliberation and a focus on the particular. So people have to make judgments about how to apply the laws in particular cases. Quote, "It is proper for the laws, when rightly laid down, to be sovereign, while the rulers or ruler in office should have supreme powers over matters as to which the laws are quite unable to pronounce with precision because of the difficulty of making a general rule to cover all cases." So the assembly applies the laws in a particular case, makes decision about going to war or not and other issues, and then the jury applies the laws to the particular case of whoever is up on trial. The most fundamental principle of justice is, quote, "Authority should be exercised in the interest of the ruled." That is why those constitutions that aim at the common advantage are in effect rightly framed in accordance with absolute justice, while those that aim at the ruler's own advantage only are faulty and are all of them derived a deviation from the right constitutions, for they have an element of despotism, whereas a city is a partnership of free human beings. Unquote. Constitutions can be organized around the rule of one person, the rule of a few, or the rule of many. When the rule of one person is exercised for the sake of the common good, the government is called monarchy. When the rule of one is exercised at the expense of the common good, for the sake of the ruler alone, the government is a tyranny. When the rule of a few is truly the rule of the best, those able to rule for the common good, the government is an aristocracy. When the rule of the few is exercised for the sake of the rulers and not the common good, the government is an oligarchy. When a nation has a democracy, it should be governed by the laws, and the people should provide stability and order by exercising virtue in relation to each other. This is a healthy democracy. But when the masses are self-indulgent, and they vote to override the laws by decrees made in the assembly, and when they are influenced in their decisions by demagogues, this is a politically corrupt society. Quote, "And a democracy of this nature is comparable to the tyrannical form of monarchy, because their spirit is the same, and both exercise despotic control over the better classes, and the decrees voted by the assembly are like the commands issued in a tyranny, and the demagogues and the flatterers are the same people, or in a corresponding class, and either set has the very strongest influence with the respective ruling power, the flatterers with the tyrants, and the demagogue with democracies of this kind. And these people cause the resolutions of the assembly to be supreme, and not the laws, by referring all things to the people. Such a democracy is not a constitution at all, for where the laws do not govern, there's no constitution." Unquote. So a demagogue panders to the masses and tells them, if you vote for me, I'll make you rich, or we'll take the money away from the rich and distribute it to you, and create chaos. And the people are flattered by them and moved by a demagogue, because they're really mini tyrants. They just want to use the system of laws to get as rich and powerful as possible. And so they're malleable. By a demagogue can punch their buttons and cause them to undermine their laws, and then he or she can take over. Aristotle argues that at any one time there's one best kind of just political regime for that society. Some societies do not have enough educated people to sustain a democracy, so aristocracy or monarchy might be more appropriate as long as the aristocrats or the monarchs rule for the well-being of the ruled. A society might change from being suited to a monarchy to being more suited to aristocracy or democracy. One property of a just society is that it has the largest possible middle class. Even though the standard of life represented by the phrase middle class is different from one time and place to another, and the size of the middle class possible in any given society is at any given time changes, a large middle class provides the most social stability. Quote, since then it is admitted that what is moderate or in the middle is best, it is manifest that the middle amount of all the good things of fortune is the best amount to possess, for this degree of wealth is the readiest to obey reason. The middle class are the least inclined to shun office and to covet office, and both these tendencies are injurious to states. The ideal of the state is to consist as much as possible of persons that are equal and alike, and this similarly is most found in the middle classes. This class of citizens have the greatest security in the states. The political community administered by the middle class is the best. Unquote. Since any form of political association can be corrupted, it's important that the citizens of any state be educated to be able to rule and be ruled in a way which preserves the Constitution. Quote, the greatest of all the means spoken of to secure the stability of constitutions is a system of education suited to the constitutions, for there's no use in the most valuable laws ratified by the unanimous judgments of the whole body of citizens if these are not trained and educated in the Constitution, popularly if the laws are popular, oligarchically if they are oligarchical. Unquote. But since political corruption comes about because people desire money and power, they want to rule for the sake of themselves rather than for the common good. The most important factor in education is to teach people to desire the common good. Quote, for there is such a thing as want of self-discipline in a state as well as in an individual. But to have been educated to suit the Constitution does not mean to do the things that give pleasure to the adherents of oligarchy or the supporters of democracy, but the things that will enable the former to govern oligarchically, which means the few govern for the well-being of everyone, and the latter to govern themselves democratically, which means to vote and for the sake of what actually is in the common good. But at present, in the oligarchies, the sons of the rulers are luxurious, while in the democracies they define liberty wrongly, for there are two things that are thought to be defining features of democracy: the sovereignty of the majority and liberty. For justice is supposed to be equality, and equality the sovereignty of whatever may have been decided by the multitude, and liberty doing just what one likes. Hence, in democracies of this sort, when democracy becomes corrupt, people define liberty wrongly. They define it as living as you like. In democracies of this sort, everybody lives as they like, and unto whatever end, whatever goal he desires, as Euripides says. But this is bad, for to live in conformity with the Constitution ought not to be considered slavery, but safety. Unquote. The key to developing and sustaining a high level of practical wisdom among an assembly of citizens in a democracy is the reinvigoration of education. Education must focus on the cultivation of all the virtues, since the virtue of justice is clearly an outgrowth of the personal and social virtues. Since virtue concerns actions, and actions must include emotions, an education for the virtues must involve an education of the emotions. Music is one aspect of education which tries to cultivate healthy emotions and to purge the soul of unhealthy ones. Quote, Music produces an effect on the moral character of the soul, unquote. And another quote, Aristotle says, use the most ethical harmonies for education and the active and passionate kinds for listening to when others are performing, for any experience that occurs violently in some souls is found in all, though with different degrees of intensity. For example, pity and fear, and also religious excitement, for some persons are very liable to this form of education, and under the influence of sacred music we see these people, when they use tunes that violently arouse the soul, being thrown into a state as if they had received medicinal treatment and taken a purge. The same experience then must come also to the compassionate and the timid and the other emotional people generally, in such degree as befalls each individual of these classes, and all must undergo a purgation and a pleasant feeling of relief, and similarly also the purgative melodies afford harmless delight to people. Therefore, those who do go in for theatrical music must be set to compete in harmonies and melodies of this kind, and since the audiences of two classes, one free and educated and the other the vulgar, the latter sort also must be assigned competitions and shows for relaxation, and just as their souls are warped from the natural state, so those harmonies and melodies that are highly strung and irregular in coloration or deviations, but people of each sort receive pleasure from what is naturally suited to them, unquote. This discussion of music as a means to education in order to improve the quality of life and a political association leads to a discussion of the nature of arts and human production in general. So, what he's saying about music is that you use music to magnify human beings' emotions and allow them so that they're not repressed. Allow these emotions to become active, and then people can express these emotions and they get released from the soul. So there's some, like if people have violent emotions, you take the Artemis and Dionysus, people would go out into the wilderness and engage in extremely energetic, not necessarily violent, energetic dances and orgies, and release all of that energy and become more integrated, more in harmony with the universe, because they're not repressing some kind of poisonous emotion. Basically, their unhealthy emotions are just like a kind of psychological poison in the body. So you shouldn't repress it or deny it. You should magnify it, expose it, and then flush it out. And the one very common example is the desire for revenge, because when people get hurt, they have revenge fantasies. So a lot of tragedies magnify those, and they show people actually living out their revenge and actually killing or harming, do all this harm. And so you can recognize that in your own psyche, and you can go, oh, I don't want to do that. So flush it out. So the same is with music. You bring everything into consciousness that's been repressed, and then you change, because you decide, I don't think I even want that in my soul. I don't want it to be there. I want to have more creative, positive emotions. I don't want to have these poisons that I have to repress, or that I might even act out on at some point. I want to just get rid of it and be a person of more, I want to flourish. I want to be virtuous. I want to have integrity. I want to get it right. So that's part of education, is flushing out the dark side. And tragedy and music, the way the arts work in Greek culture is, boy, they try to dig out every possible negative emotion they can, and you hear about it, and you see it, and you see the characters, and you see all the arguments, and it helps you understand the human condition. Helps you understand yourself. It helps you understand other people, And it helps prevent people from actually having and then acting upon all those poisonous thoughts and desires.